So if you haven't heard by now, the game formerly known as Fire Emblem, and now known apparently as the Game Boy Advance version of Fire Emblem, sure, let's go with that, just came to Nintendo Switch Online. While this game was my introduction to the series way back when, it's not one that I have a ton of nostalgia for. Honestly, it's kind of middle of the road for me as far as Fire Emblem goes. Not many of the characters really grab me, and the gameplay is a bit messier than I typically like, but as a first game, it was fine, and I'm glad to see it getting more exposure now. With all that said, however, I have noticed a trend over the last few years when it comes to talking about this game. It's not uncommon for fans analyzing Blazing Blade to claim that it has a bad story, to the degree that this claim seems nearly as accepted as the consensus that Fates is bad apart from Conquest gameplay, because face-touching and plot holes. I'm not sure if I'd be willing to get up and counter with the opposite, that Blazing Blade's story is actually good, but nevertheless, something about the way this game is discussed now doesn't sit quite right with me. Part of that is just because I've never been into the CinemaSins-esque style of analysis that centers around nitpicking errors and plot holes. Like, yes, there's a fair amount of silly writing in FE7. And, by the way, if you don't know why I occasionally refer to Blazing Blade as FE7, I made a whole video about that, so go check that out. Anyway though, there are gaps in logic, and repetitive amnesia plots, and pacing issues, and a lack of clear direction half the time. But looking only at those elements kind of feels like it's missing the forest for the trees. So why is Blazing Blade remembered in the way that it is? I mean, aside from guys being horny over Lyn, that is. Because while that is indeed a factor in her ongoing popularity, I don't think it's doing all that much for her game as a whole. After all, Lyn mode, once you remove the self-insert element embodied in FE7's proto-avatar, is more than anything notorious for being 10 chapters worth of a forced tutorial that only gets somewhat interesting when you replay it in hard mode and the game takes the training wheels off. Lyn and her story are awkward side pieces in a narrative that already struggles to maintain focus in a way that Fire Emblem rarely does. This is because of something that has become unexpectedly relevant again to the modern series thanks to Engage. I said back in one of my videos on that game that Engage has arguably the least politically interested plot in all of Fire Emblem, and the arguably bit there is because of FE7. Engage teases at a mundane political war between Brodia and Deluzia, but in reality that conflict is only relevant in the story's first arc. After that, the focus shifts back to collecting magical rings to fight zombies, and it's not long before all the royals are on the same side and gradually sweeping their nation's aggression toward one another under the rug. FE7 doesn't even have that much. There is the suggestion that the civil unrest in the Lycian League may lead to war, and there's an arc about 2/3 of the way through the story that feels like filler until the epilogue when it's revealed that it was actually setting up the war to come in Binding Blade. But that's pretty much it. For the majority of the game, your enemies are not the soldiers of an opposing country, but rather the members of an assassin's guild with a ludicrously large hiring budget, as well as connections to a sorcerer who can create armies of artificial humans. I could make the argument that every other Fire Emblem story, even Engage's to an extent, is a variation on the original plot of Shadow Dragon from all the way back in 1990. However, I don't know if I could do that for FE7. What connection it has to what I refer to as the series standard plot exists only in its role as the prequel to FE6, which, again, could be passed off as a filler arc on your first playthrough if you didn't know this was a prequel. That alone is reason enough to take issue with broad dismissals of Blazing Blade's story, since if the game spends most of its time flailing around looking for story threads, it's only because it can't fall back on the predictable motions that define other Fire Emblem plots. And I personally have never been one to fault this series for being formulaic. The same is true for pretty much every other big Nintendo IP. It's just that it's more noticeable in Fire Emblem because the excuse plot is much more in your face, and there's way more text to sift through. What props up FE7 in place of a cohesive, familiar story is the same thing that most of the games rely on to stand out and stay memorable: their character work. Eliwood got a lot of flack back in the day, partly because he's not a consistently good unit, but also because he was frequently denigrated as the weaker and more emotional of the game's two male lords. In actuality, Eliwood was probably the most emotionally rounded lord up to that point. He struggles with several personal tragedies over the course of his story, and he's forced to process and try to move past them in the moment, something Marth never really gets to do because the majority of his baggage is in his backstory, and something Sigurd never gets to do because the moment his world comes crashing down, so too do the fiery boulders. And unlike Leif or Roy, Eliwood isn't always accompanied by older mentor figures who can talk him through the harsh realities of the world and try to steer him onto the right path. Rather, Eliwood's constant companions are a pair of his own peers, who, being teenagers themselves, can also be impulsive and immature, and sometimes distracted by their own issues that are going on in the background of the main plot. At least until you play Hector mode, and suddenly it's not clear what's actually in the background. Hector's almost as much of a fan favorite as Lyn, and his mode is preferred over Eliwood's for its difficulty, but the more you think about Hector mode, the less sense it makes. Even if Hector is more frequently the point of view character and gets a handful of emotionally charged scenes to himself that are missing in Eliwood mode, this story remains essentially Eliwood's. Elward's disappearance is still the inciting incident, and it's still Eliwood who forms a close relationship with FE7's resident amnesiac waif Ninian. The additional content involving Hector's insecurities over his leadership capabilities and his grief over his brother's death add nothing of note to the central conflict with Nurgle. Hector being told he's going to die in battle is a neat call forward to Binding Blade, spoiler, I guess, and you can potentially recruit Carla, who goes on to become wife and mother to characters in the sequel, but that's it as far as what Hector mode contributes to the connective tissue between the Elevian games. Instead, the big exclusive story reveals of Hector mode all center around main villain Nurgle, his former family, his memory loss, and his treatment of his first morph. I must reiterate, none of this has anything to do with Hector, and yet it's all exclusive to his mode, provided you also fulfill some of the most obscure unlock requirements for paralogs in the entire series. Looked at this way, what even is Hector mode, aside from a step up in difficulty? If I'm inclined to criticize anything about FE7's story, it's that, not the main story, which at least attempts to have some sort of cohesive point. Said point being, at least as best as I can describe it, a stab at a more typical JRPG narrative of an evil sorcerer trying to conquer/destroy the world, as opposed to the war story that the series had gotten comfortable telling throughout its first decade. Put into context, that's quite the dramatic swerve. The previous game, Binding Blade, comes as close to a soft reboot of FE1 as the series has ever done, aside from flat-out remakes, and it's understandable that Intelligent Systems would have wanted to play it safe for the first game made without the series' creator. While Kaga himself did write multiple stories in the same setting more than once, he never really veered away from the standard plot. Gaiden approximately recreates Marth's story on a different continent and with two protagonists. Mystery of the Emblem might as well just be Shadow Dragon 2, and Thracia is a midquel playing out its own smaller standard plot nested inside the larger standard plot of Genealogy, like a turducken of formulaic war stories. But when IS came up with the idea to write a prequel to FE6, and one that would formally introduce the franchise to the rest of the world, they swung wide. I don't know if the international release was the reason behind some of Blazing Blade's more unusual qualities, But given that one of those qualities is a forced tutorial mode, it wouldn't surprise me very much. Perhaps the developers believe that, without the nostalgia factor coming from the older games, Western players wouldn't connect with a political war drama, and so instead they opted for a broader fantasy story. And broad it is, although looking past the well-worn cliches and half-hearted explorations of existential dread, there's some good stuff in here as well. I've already talked about Elliewood, and if dysfunctional family narratives are your thing, then Blazing Blade's got you covered as well, not only with the burned royal family drama, but also with the leaders of the Black Fang and their whole corrupted found family dynamic. Sonya happens to be one of my favorite villains in the entire series, in part because this line is just so relatable, but also because the revelation that she believes she's human until the point where she's no longer useful is probably the most interesting thing the game ever does with its morph concept. Also, Nino is one of those characters you just can't help but feel bad for, especially with the messed up implications left behind by her twins in Binding Blade and... hang on, how old is Nino again? Oh. Fire Emblem is gonna Fire Emblem sometimes. Just ask Priscilla and Raven. On that note, it is rather remarkable how well FE7 serves as an introduction to the series, even without the standard plot to anchor it. The game is still about embattled nobility undergoing character development as they defend their lands from flat minor villains and sympathetic major antagonists, flavored with the usual amount of abstractly philosophical dragon lore, and, as I said, the unconventional sexual element that may as well be Fire Emblem's trademark. Blazing Blade may not wear that kind of content on its sleeve in the same way that any of the games with avatars do, but I distinctly remember it being a talking point even back when the game was current, because who else was doing anything like this, especially on a Nintendo platform? As it happens, that observation also extends to my specialty, the gay stuff. It's little wonder that the Western fandom would be primed to dive into the abundant subtext of the Tellius games a few years later, when FE7 already offered some of that material. Digging through the archives of fanfiction.net may surprise you with which pairings were the most popular back then, Matthew and Guy being a notable standout since I don't think anyone even thinks of these two nowadays. But the impulse to ship outside strictly heteronormative lines was already there. And that's only what was going on in my corner of the fandom. Elsewhere, quote-unquote retellings of Lynn's story that shipped her with the tactician were all over the place, which for better or worse may have foreshadowed the overwhelming popularity of avatar dating sims in the modern series. FE7 has enjoyed real staying power, even if its story isn't the most coherent and doesn't hold up to heavy scrutiny. That's, after all, more or less true of every Fire Emblem, and yet Blazing Blade is the one that, above all the rest, really went out there and tried something new. If I were to attempt to piece together some uniform theory of Fire Emblem stories, because I clearly need something better to do in my free time, the game that most resists easy classification isn't Fates, or Three Houses, or even Engage, really. It's this 20-year-old title. For the most part, in 2003, players outside Japan lacked the context to understand why FE7 was so unusual. We gradually acquired that knowledge through subsequent releases, as well as exposure to the older games via remakes and better fan translations. But nonetheless, Blazing Blade resonated enough with its non-Japanese audience that, bar this one little hiccup and also some Fates DLC, Fire Emblem has been an international franchise ever since. Personally, I think that's worth forgiving a couple of plot holes. But that's just me. If you've played FE7, what's your take on the game's story, and the way that people talk about it? If you haven't, but are maybe thinking about checking it out now that it's available on the NSO, what appeals to you about the game, and what are you expecting from it? Share your thoughts down below in the comments. And of course, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to my channel for more off-the-cuff FE content, plus whatever else I'm feeling in any given month. I'm getting so close to my next subscriber milestone, and I've already got a fun Fire Emblem related idea in mind for when I get there. Also, I rarely plug in these videos, but if you want to support the channel as well as get early access to my videos and more of a say in the kind of content I put together, I'd really appreciate it if you became a patron. My patrons are a huge help to me, in more than just the obvious financial way. Links are, of course, down below. Thanks for watching, everyone. Au revoir!